So let's go over your chapter notes for chapter 19. America had many Wests. For the first American colonies, West was the part of the forested area that lay just beyond those original colonies. Pre-Civil War, when we talked about West, we were referring to the area between Mississippi and Missouri. But the last West is what we usually think of when we talk about the American West or the Wild West. It includes the area from Missouri all the way over to the Pacific. In a way, the last West was kind of like a colony to the eastern part of the United States that had already been established for some time. Many cattle ranchers in the West or many cattle ranches in the West were actually owned by people in the East. And then, of course, you have Washington, D.C. making all of the decisions for the West, even though they are in the East, and really didn't consider a lot of times the people who lived in the West, especially the Native Americans. The land in the American West was diverse, all 1.2 million square miles of it. The Great Plains is a level plateau that gradually rises toward the west. In the eastern part of the Great Plains, rainfall is about 20 inches per year, which is great for growing grain. The western part of the band, like around the Black Hills area of South Dakota, that area catches moisture from the Pacific and has sufficient rainfall that way. But everywhere else in between, rainfall was not dependable at all and not good for farming. The Rocky Mountains form the eastern rim of the Great Basin, which includes Nevada, western Utah, and northern Arizona, and parts of extreme southeast California. We're talking desert, big time desert. It's hot, it's arid, but just as a side note, if you ever get a chance to go to Williams, Arizona in the summertime, you should so do it. It's at the top of the mountain, looking down into the Grand Canyon, so at the top of the mountain it offers much cooler air than the surrounding desert. The Cascade and Sierra Nevada mountains form the western rim of the Great Basin, and this includes Oregon, Washington, and California's coastal hills. Then from San Francisco Bay northward, the Pacific Coast region is rainy with warmer winters and cool, dry summers. South of San Francisco, the climate is Mediterranean, which is warm all year and only sparse winter rains. In 1872, Congress set aside 2 million acres in northwest Wyoming for Yellowstone National Park. It's the first national park in the country. Ferdinand Hayden, who is now known as the father of our national park system, actually sold the idea to Congress based on the curiosities that travelers would see when they went there, like geysers. You know, we hear of Old Faithful. So he didn't do it to preserve the nature, which is important to keep in mind as we're talking about this focus on West. He did not do it to preserve nature. He did it to exploit the resources of the area. So you'd think that a natural progression of westward expansion would mean that people from the east moved to the west and maybe settled along the way, like they would settle the land that they came to and then eventually end up along the Pacific coast. But it was actually just the opposite. The Pacific coast was settled first, and that's because of water access. And then the plains area was next, along with the Great Basin. You know, there was at least part of that had rainfall and rich fertile soil. The fertile soil in Oregon's Willamette Valley was the first to draw settlers around 1840, followed by California's Gold Rush then in the 1850s. The middle section of the basin was settled next, with as many people from the west as from the east, because after the Gold Rush ended in California, those people started making their way back toward the east and exploring along the way to see if they could find gold anywhere else. And then people from the east were moving west as well. The Great Plains were settled largely by people from the Mississippi Valley area because they had skills that involved agriculture, and then the Great Plains, where growing was possible, the people from the Mississippi Valley could continue using their agricultural experiences there. The Native American cultures in the West were just as diverse as the land itself was. The Navajo, Apache, Hopi, and Zuni were just a few of the tribes there, just to name a few. The Native Americans of the Wild West that we consider were the Plains Indians, and they were the ones who were tall and bronzed and had long, straight black hair and high cheekbones. They were in both the agricultural areas of the Great Plains and then in the areas that were not good for agriculture. So those people who did not live in the fertile plains, instead of being farmers like that particular area was able to provide, the ones who lived in the areas that were not fertile were nomadic hunters. So they had to roam. They did not set up settlements. They roamed. They looked for food. They looked for shelter. And because the Plains Indians, these nomadic people that we're talking about who hunted and moved for food, they specifically posed some problems for the American settlers who wanted their land. For one, the American pioneers wanted the territory that the Native Americans were hunting. So remember, they didn't have settlements there, but they were hunting that land. Two, the standard acts of intimidation that Americans would use against the Native Americans wouldn't be effective on them. They were not able to be intimidated by pioneers who might burn their crops or homes because these nomads had neither. They had no crops, they had no homes. So in theory, these nomadic Plains Indians literally had nothing to lose. Culturally, the Native American attitude differed greatly from that of the average white pioneer. White settlers saw the land as a resource to be exploited by men, something there for their use. The Native Americans, though, saw it as a collective treasure, part of their family or tribe. Nomadic tribes could not honor boundaries because they needed to wander wherever, whenever, to find food and shelter. And you're welcome to spend some time looking at this map. If you'd like to pause here and take a look, this map shows Native American relations beyond the Mississippi River from 1850 to 1890. It's a good 40-year span. Starting in 1871, the federal government began negotiating with the Native Americans as though their tribes were independent Indian nations. This benefited the white settlers because obviously the federal government was huge and the tribes they negotiated with were much smaller. It created a system of exploitation of the Native Americans and their lands. Until the 1850s, the federal government tried to keep a section of land for permanent Native American frontier, but the California gold rush ruined that. As the rush expanded, or even as it ended in California and people wanted to explore other areas, they convinced the government to allow them onto this territory so that they could pursue wealth and riches. This actually brought about the reservation policy. By accepting the idea of a reservation, the tribes believed that they would be protected from further white settlement and exploitation that came with it. They thought that they would be taught more about agriculture and white culture too. The problem is that the white settlers still cheated them regarding the reservation borders. The most important treaties to the Plains tribes came in 1851 and 1853. The Forts Laramie and Atkinson treaties made the Native American promise to live in peace with whites forever and to allow whites to build roads through their territories. The treaties also specifically outlined their tribal land that eventually became the Plains Reservation. Native Americans were involved in the American Civil War as well. Some Native Americans in what is now Oklahoma owned slaves themselves, so for that reason they were sympathetic to the South. Some, however, sided with the Union, and that division caused problems for the Native Americans. And some of them fought for each side. Some fought for the Confederacy, some fought for the Union. There were other battles between Native Americans and whites. Discontent over the reservation policy among the Sioux caused a major war to break out in Minnesota between the Native Americans and the federal government. The worst Civil War era battle with the Native Americans is known as the Chivington Massacre of Colorado Territory. It happened in the spring of 1864. Cheyenne chief Black Kettle refused a government order to move his tribe to a small reservation. He began a campaign of raiding mining camps and attacking mail delivery coaches. But, even though that started in the spring, by the fall they quit and decided to sue for peace. But the whites wanted revenge. So one night, Colonel Chivington sent troops to Sand Creek to kill the sleeping Cheyenne tribe. Black Kettle tried to surrender, but the American troop ignored his white flag. Then the troops proceeded to kill 450 members of the Cheyenne Native American tribe, 2/3 of which were women and children. Then they scalped and mutilated many of those Native Americans. At the end of the Civil War, the Republican Party was dedicated at that point to social and racial justice. They just won freedom for slaves, and they were appalled by the Chivington Massacre. So Easterners wanted a peace policy with Native Americans. However, a large section of whites living in the West wanted to eliminate the Native Americans altogether. When Chief Red Cloud's warriors attacked a U.S. troop in 1866 near Fort Philip Kearny in Wyoming, stronger tensions mounted. Finally, though, peace promoters let me try that again. That's a mouthful. Finally, though, peace prevailed. In 1867, Congress created a federal peace commission to end the violence and war in the plains. The government solution was to restrict the Native Americans to reservations and to civilize them, which meant they couldn't roam anymore. And they agreed to supply the Native Americans with the necessities that they would need until they could learn to become self-sufficient. Ultimately, though, the whites continued to encroach on the reservations, and the government fell through on its promises of supplies. Destruction of the buffalo herds for the Plains Indians hit them really hard. Remember, this was their source of food, but at this point, white men were moving in and hunting for sport, and they would sometimes even kill just massive amounts of buffalo and leave their carcasses lying there to rot or waste. By 1883, 13 million buffalo had been killed. Without their main food source to hunt, the Plains had to stop their nomadic lifestyle and become dependent on government handouts. They resisted the reservation policy, but their lifestyle, all their traditions, were taken from them, and eventually they just had no choice. They had to take the reservation offer. In the 1870s, the government tried to restrict whites from the Native American reservations, but they gave in when prospectors again insisted to have the chance to look for gold. The Sioux tribe pushed back, and then they were seen as renegades. The Sioux turned to Chief Sitting Bull for help. Sitting Bull did not favor the reservation plan, and he told the others they had been fools to even sign on to the agreement. But he allied with Chief Crazy Horse and encouraged the Sioux to rebel. That made him, naturally, a target for the American government. On June 25, 1876, Colonel George Custer walked into a trap at Little Bighorn River. Sitting Bull's warriors were ready and killed Custer and all 264 of his soldiers. So while that sounds like an incredible victory for the Sioux tribe, it actually created a bigger problem for them. The government sent more troops west to fight, forcing the Sioux to surrender and give up most of the Black Hills region that they had called home for forever. Over the next 14 years, Native Americans stayed on reservations, but they resented it. Anger continued to grow among them. Another battle came about in December 1890 at Wounded Knee on a Sioux reservation in South Dakota. Ironically, it was the Native Americans' attempt to achieve peace that led to this attack on them. A Native American prophet named Wovoka preached to his people that they could live with their ancestors in this paradise, which basically is the Native American equivalent of Garden of Eden. To achieve this peace, he preached that they must practice love, hard work, peace with the whites, and participate in the ghost dance. This dance was a ceremony of spiritual singing and dancing to the point that the participants would enter this kind of state of trance. It sounds harmless, but the government didn't see it that way. They thought maybe it was inciting the tribes to violence instead of to peace. The commander of the U.S. 7th Cavalry tried to disarm the ghost dancers at Wounded Knee, and a hand fight ensued. When the Native Americans broke through the Army line, the soldiers opened fire on them, killing at least 130, and most of those were women and children. A book by Helen Hunt Jackson in 1881 called attention to the tragedies that the Native Americans had faced and brought about the hope of reform by influential congressmen. New Native American schools were constructed on reservations and off to teach them how to read and write English and to learn trades that could help them prosper, presumably, on their reservations. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 created presidential power to divide up land to give each head of household in these Native American tribes 160-acre plots on which to live. And then if these people had minor children, they got a little more land, something that they could pass down to their children. While it sounds great that the government made this offer, the Dawes Act basically attacked the whole premise of tribal life. Tribal life consisted more of community village type of raising a family and participating in culture. But the Dawes Act with the 160 acres spread people out more, so they did not have that same it didn't have the same tribal effect that would have allowed them to continue their normal life. It actually basically forced them to assimilate or to become more white-like and to enculture them into that white lifestyle. In the 1920s, white people started revisiting this idea again, and there was a social reformer named John Collier who said that Native Americans should be guaranteed the same basic civil rights and the ability to save and preserve their traditions and culture. So that was in 1920. It still took 14 years, but in 1934, Collier got the Wheeler-Howard Act passed in Congress. It repealed the allotment policies of Dawes and Curtis, which broke the land down into 160-acre plots. And it allowed them to reestablish their own government and culture on their own reservations, also their own economy. And the idea behind that was the purpose of preserving and promoting their own culture. So it wasn't a perfect fix, but at least in the 1920s through, we see the change actually happen in 1934, it showed that the white Americans were actually starting to understand the damage that they had caused to the Native Americans. This is a portrait of Sitting Bull, who led to Custer's big defeat at Little Bighorn in 1876. Let's shift gears a little now and talk about the economy of this era. Mining built and killed communities throughout the West. In the early 1890s, a town called Creede, Colorado, which is pictured here, grew by several hundred people per day, all coming to bask in the glory of the riches of silver mining. But within 10 years, this town was nothing but a ghost town. In the late 1850s, prospectors from California started looking elsewhere for precious metals like gold and silver. When the gold was discovered then around Pikes Peak in Colorado in 1859, Colorado became the place to be. One of the richest gold strikes ever happened in the Nevada territory, which they called the Comstock Lode, after a drifter who claimed that it was actually his discovery. Anyway, that drew a lot of prospectors to Nevada. Gold was also found in several other places, including Idaho and South Dakota, and then at the end of the 1800s, gold was discovered in Alaska and the Yukon Territory. Most mining towns started out as tent towns. Some grew to be towns with homes and stores, only to be abandoned later when those precious metals ran out. But some stayed to start the mining process. So remember, the gold rush began with prospectors skimming as much as they could from rivers and streams. The ore still existed there, it just had to be dug out. that's where mining got started. So some miners who stuck it out made fortunes and created big businesses for themselves, adding much needed money for improved cities. The big industry in Texas was cattle because of the availability of the grasslands in the territory. Challenged for ways to get Texas beef to consumers after the Civil War, the industry used the expanding railroad to get beef where it needed to be. So the cattle drives pushed cattle to the Missouri Pacific Railroad, where they were loaded and shipped east. Entrepreneurs then developed other ideas. Joseph G. McCoy established a depot in central Kansas near the Kansas Pacific Railroad, where ranchers could pen their animals while they arranged for sale elsewhere. More businessmen borrowed this idea, and cow towns were established, such as Newton and Dodge City in Kansas. From the 1870s to the 1880s, the cattle industry flourished. Cattle ranchers used public lands in Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, also Idaho and parts of the Dakotas, on which to graze their cattle. So basically, they're raising cattle on free food, all of this grassland on public property. Some Easterners invested in land in the Great Plains and then created cattle ranches. In 1885, people became concerned about the lack of grass across the plains. Landowners began using fences to keep others from moving cattle across their land. Of course, this couldn't be done on public lands. You can't put a fence on a public land. So as people entered the cattle industry, the supply increased to the point that it outweighed the demand. So cattle prices began to fall. Then after a harsh winter in 1886, followed by a drought the very next summer, the cattle industry seemed to take a hit. It survived, but never at that same level that it previously had. Cattle ranchers weren't the only people benefiting from Western land grants. Policies by which the government granted some of this land were inconsistent, though, and some of those people who had land grants felt betrayed. They blamed the remoteness of the federal government, which, remember, is all the way back in Washington, D.C., and outside speculators who were influencing political decisions. The Homestead Act gave big pieces of land to settlers. The Morrill Land Grant College Act gave each state a portion of land to start a state-run agriculture mechanical college. So an ag mechanical college is what we usually see today as A&M. So as in Texas A&M, that would stand for Agriculture and Mechanical College. The railroad land grants were also issued in the 1860s and 1870s, which meant that's even more land that's not going to potential farmers. It's not available for homesteading because it's being given to the railroad industry. Farmers complained that very little free land was actually being granted, that instead it was being sold for cash or donated for railroad development. The Homestead Act grants didn't take into account the needs of farmers in the plains. So these 160-acre parcels that they gave to farmers seemed great on the surface, but it didn't account for the fact that cattle need at least 40 acres of grazing land in order to survive. So at best, 160 acres would, serve 4 cows. That's not nearly enough to begin a lucrative cattle ranching farm. Between 1862 and 1904, 147 million acres of free land had been granted to farmers. In that same period of time, though, 610 acres had been sold. After the Civil War, the government passed several laws to deal with problems that specifically did face the West. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 allowed farmers to take out another 160 acres of adjacent land if they would plant trees on some part of it. They had the idea that trees would encourage rain, which is much needed in an arid climate. Of course, the farmers weren't held to it, and they didn't always plant trees, and they ended up with another 10 million acres of dry land, basically. The Desert Land Act of 1877 is considered today to have been a giveaway to cattle companies. It allowed lands to be bought for 25 cents per acre if the buyer agreed to irrigate it. Large tracts of land passed to cattle companies through a transfer loophole in the plan. And then the Timber Stone Act of 1878 applied to lands that were not fit for growing and only had value because of the timber or stone on those lands. People could buy up to 160-acre plots at $2.50 per acre. Few farmers benefited from this at all, and honestly, most of that land ended up going to the timber companies. There were several problems that farmers faced as they tried to cultivate the West that needed creative solutions. To combat the lack of rainfall, farmers started using a form of dry farming. And so this is where they would pack mulch around the roots of seedlings in order to hold in as much water as possible as the plants continued to grow. And then barbed wire was necessary to protect their land. And barbed wire was used because it was cheap, easy to install, and just a few rolls of it could cover a large area. To address labor shortages in the plains, farmers created more harvesting and threshing machines, which led to increased productivity. As a matter of fact, by 1899, the U.S. was producing more than 600 million bushels of wheat per year, and most of it was coming from the Great Plains. The Pacific Coast became the nation's fruit and vegetable source. Oregon grew apples, pears, peaches, plums, and grapes. Washington grew apples and pears. California grew grapes, and by 1900 was responsible for making more than 80% of the country's wine. California also started growing oranges. Then in 1893, fruit owners got together and organized the Southern California Fruit Exchange, and later began marketing those fruits under a brand name you may still recognize today, Sunkist. This map shows the agricultural regions of the United States as we're talking about them in this time. You can see where forest, hay, and pasture land prevailed, also wheat. You can see in Arkansas we were part of the Cotton Belt. Even though it seemed as though agriculture was doing well, farmers felt like they were being taken advantage of by bankers and mortgage owners. They kept interest rates high even in bad crop years, which threw the farmers into debt and foreclosure. In a way, the farmers saw it as though the bankers and mortgage owners were biting the hands that fed them. Interest rates were higher in the West and South than in the North and East, affecting the nation's agrarian centers. But we know now that the bankers didn't want the farms to close because their business was actually better if the farms stayed open. Often they even extended payment terms for these farmers. Grain and cotton farmers were subject to more instability than any other producers, leaving them on a roller coaster of sorts, never knowing if the prices were going to be up or down, or if the market, on the market, as they tried to adjust to a world starting into new industrialization that was more impersonal than ever before. So there were some uncertainties there for farmers for sure. And then agrarianism develops. It's an attitude that arose presenting farmers as the real American, the backbone of America, that sort of thing. You know, the people who feed America, because they were feeding America. So then this leads to organizations that are formed to help offer social and educational opportunities for farmers. Granges were fraternal orders of farmers founded to offer social and educational opportunities to farmers in the prairie, not just farmers, but to their wives and their families. Soon, the Granges became politically active, acting as kind of a sort of early lobbyist. They fought against high railroad freight charges and for regulation of railroad and grain elevator laws. Grangers negotiated large purchases at what we would consider today to be wholesale prices. And then a group formed Montgomery Ward and Company specifically to deal with the Grangers and their needs. In conclusion, development of the last West was detrimental for the Native American. In comparison, it was great for the white Americans who benefited from land grants, even though they also had their own sets of challenges.